Okay, so we're back, and let's take a look at this sentence. The field of cognitive psychology is filled with fascinating scientific findings of interesting phenomena. The field of cognitive psychology is filled with fascinating scientific findings of interesting phenomena. The field of cognitive psychology is filled with fascinating scientific findings of interesting phenomena. All right, so this is our sentence. In that sentence, how many F's were there? The field of cognitive psychology is filled with fascinating scientific findings of interesting phenomena. How many F's? Make it a little easier for your cognitive load. It's somewhere between 4 and 8. The field of cognitive psychology is filled with fascinating scientific findings of interesting phenomena. So the correct answer is 7. And of course it should be the F in field, the two F's that are in the words of, the F in filled, fascinating scientific findings. Sometimes people will mark 8 because in their memory they hear phenomenon, they hear the sound, and so they give it another F. So this is a sound perception. I know this chapter is called visual perception, but it's a sound perception example because the reason why it's a sound perception is because when we process language, even if you're reading it, it's a sound activity. It's a sound-based activity. So, because you didn't suddenly go blind and think that PH was an F. You didn't suddenly go blind and forget that the F's in of are F's, not V's. That's another really common error is people will say there's 5 F's because they forget about the F's in of. Because it sounds like a V. It's an auditory example, right? Because even if you're reading it with your eyes, you actually hear it inside of your head. And those pronunciations can bias our perception of what letters we're experiencing. So I'm sorry, it's visual perception. I'm kind of mixing some stuff together because that's just sort of how I am. That's how I roll. All right, let's get back to some visual stuff. Form perception. There are some very specific organizational rules for how we make sense of forms, how we decide what makes up an object, one intact object. These are called grouping principles. And these grouping principles were actually developed by the Gestalt psychologists back in the 1930s as they were trying to figure out, remember back in the very beginning of this class, I talked about Wilhelm Wundt and his approach to introspection, and really his goal was to study structuralism, how our conscious awareness is structured. Gestalt psychologists thought that what was wrong with introspection and structuralism is that they were trying to break consciousness down into its basic elements. And the Gestalt psychologist said, you can't do that. You can't really actually perceive an object, a thought, a thing, a concept without it being, you lose something if you break the details apart. You lose some facet of that concept if you have broken it down to its basic elements. They actually are famous for the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And what they were saying is, hey, you structuralists, if you break consciousness down into its elemental parts, putting it back together, you will have lost something. The whole is greater than putting all those parts back together, than the sum of those parts. So they developed these grouping principles that they say we follow as we are perceiving forms out in the world. So that we have a tendency, for example, to group things based on similarity. So in this example, you're more likely to see a plus sign with groups of 4 circles in each quadrant than to see it as a row of circle, circle, square, circle, circle. Like you're not very likely to see that. You're like, no, I see a form, it's a plus, and then I see these squares made up of circles, right? Like you see forms. Proximity is another rule that you follow. So in this case, you're seeing 3 columns of circles rather than independent columns. It's not 6 columns for sure. You don't see it as 6 columns. You see it as 3 columns of circles. Being near each other makes it seem like you're part of the same form. They have a phrase called good continuation, and that is illustrated in this picture where you don't see this as a series of independent dots. You see these as dots that could very easily be connected into a form that looks basically like a handwritten X, right? That it is a form. It's not a series of just unrelated dots. You continue what appears to be dots that could be connected. So good continuation is saying that if it looks like it could be connected to the parts around it, we assume it's part of the same form. Closure is very related to good continuation. Closure is where if there's a gap present, your brain will just go ahead and fill up that gap. So you're seeing a white triangle superimposed over black circles is what you're seeing in that form. And in fact, it's so convincing that there's a white triangle there that sometimes I'll have students argue with me that they can actually see an edge in that gap between the black circles. They say the white of the triangle is different from the white of the background, and they literally say, I can see an edge. And that's because your brain is filling it in. It's closing that gap, and it is not really, that triangle is not really there. It's your brain filling it in. It's called closure, and it's one of those grouping principles. And what this closure tells you is that there's a white triangle on top of 3 black circles. What is really there, the only things that are really there are 3 black circles with a wedge cut out of each of them that are oriented exactly in a position so that it looks like straight lines. But all that's really there are those circles with the gaps in them. Hard to believe, right? Element connectedness. If there is a connection between 2 elements, you will see those elements as together. Even though similarity would tell us, oh, I should think of them as 2 squares and 2 circles, the fact that each square is connected to a circle makes you think, okay, those are forms, a circle-square form and a circle-square form, because they are in fact connected. And then finally, common region. So I'm using the same example as I did for proximity because, okay, here we have, these 3 columns, but if we have, a common region where we put circles over them, we're going to say, okay, if you're in that circle, you belong together. Those that are outside the circle are not part of the form. And so common region, a great example of that happened during COVID, where they would say there's X number of cases in King County. There's X number of cases in Pierce County, things like that. And it's like as if COVID knows that there's this region called King County. It doesn't know that, obviously, but our brains work that way. So things that are inside of King County are somehow constrained and different from things that are inside Pierce County. Even though as a person, you can drive between counties without even noticing that you've driven across them, just like a virus can do. Our mental state is that that's something that's happening somewhere else, even though it's right over there. With wildfires, they'll often talk about where the wildfires are as if you're not being impacted by the smoke. The smoke crosses the region. It doesn't care that there's a line here. Oh, a fire in Oregon it might put smoke in Washington. What are you going to do? But our brain works like that. We like things to be sort of divided up, and things that are within a common region share more characteristics and probably belong to a particular form more so than things that are across, and belonging to separate regions, even though those regions are completely contiguous, just like these circles that I drew here. It's weird how our brain works, isn't it? All right, so now how you decide what is figure and what is background to be ignored. Okay, so looking at this picture, you've probably seen pictures like this in the past. And this is called given my accent, I pronounce it vase. Some of you might call it a vase. I call it a vase. So we call this the vase illusion. So if you look at the vase, you will see a black vase on a white background. But if you decide to let the white background become the figure and you ignore the black vase, now look at the white background, suddenly you see 2 faces looking at each other. You can't have simultaneously a vase and the 2 faces. It's either the faces are the figure or the vase is the figure. As soon as you put your attention on the other part of it, so like I'm looking at the faces, now I'm looking at the vase. I'm looking at the faces, now I'm looking at the vase. You can't do them simultaneously, but you can hop back and forth. So something has to be the figure and something has to be the ground. So when we talk about figure ground discrimination, we're talking about our tendency to perceive parts of the field as the figure. That's the part we're focusing on. And part of the field as the ground, the part that we can ignore. The noise is what they used to call it in the olden days, the noise. The part that you don't need to be paying attention to. Thought I'd share one that I thought was kind of cool because I think it's the Space Needle, but see, it could be the Toronto Needle. Let's just pretend like it's the Space Needle because, I'm selfish like that. Because here we have either two dogs that are black and they're facing you, so two black labs, or we have, I'm going to say the Space Needle in between them, that's white. So you can either ignore the dogs and see the Space Needle, or you can ignore the Space Needle and you see the dogs. So you have to try and figure out what part of the world is the important part that I should be paying attention to, and what part of the world is the background that I don't need to be paying attention to. So I thought I'd share this picture. I don't know how I ended up picking this picture, honestly. I just went to Google Images and was searching for something that sort of suited my needs, and I'm like, well, this one fills the needs. It's a good example. It's kind of bizarre, though. I do Google a lot of images, and just that's what I use. All right, so I hope you're enjoying this picture of, I assume, somewhere in the British Isles. I don't know. It's a field of heather. I don't know. When looking at an image like this, or looking out into the world in real life, looking out at a scene, the things that tend to pop out as the figure, the part that you should look at and focus on, tend to be bigger than other objects in the scene. They tend to be more symmetrical than other objects. They tend to be more meaningful, more inherently like you know what it is, easy to label, things like that. The figure tends to be surrounded by other things in the scene. It's not usually cut off on the edge or something like that. It's usually surrounded by other parts of the scene. It tends to be lower in the visual field, so that actually, we'll get to depth perception later, but that actually indicates it's probably closer to you than other things in the scene. And then they tend to be convex. So convex means that they are like three-dimensional and coming towards you, not receding away from you. Like if you think of a spoon, the part that you would actually balance your cereal in is the concave side. The back of the spoon is convex. It's coming towards you. So items in the scene that are convex tend to catch our attention. All right, so as I went through that list, is the thing or things that you're focusing on as the figure fulfilling all of those criteria, right? Something I want to clarify about the bigger is that it's making a bigger retinal image. It's not necessarily bigger in the real world. Like, for example, the sheep that's catching my attention, the one in the front who's apparently that one is probably objectively way smaller than a lot of things in the picture, right? Smaller than the body of water, smaller than the hills around the body of water. But the retinal image that it's casting is bigger than those other items. You could actually stop this video and physically measure it, and you'll see that the sheep is the biggest thing that's landing on our retina. It's the most symmetrical thing, right? There are other things out there, but those are all natural things that, the rocks and the body of water and all those things are sort of, abstract, right? They're naturally formed, and so they're not symmetrical. The sheep is meaningful. You're like, that's a sheep, right? I think the ground cover in the background is heather. We aren't close enough for me to get a good look at it, but it looks to me like a field of heather. So that's kind of meaningful, but not as much as a sheep that's mid-bath wearing a bell around its neck and, in the middle of a step. I mean, that's meaningful. It is certainly surrounded by the other things in the scene. It's not cut off. It's lower in the visual field, so it appears that it's closer to our viewpoint. And it is convex. Look at that belly. Look at that nose, right? It's coming towards us. And so it's fitting all of the criteria for being the thing we would focus on in this image. Now, between the two sheep, the one that I'm seeing, I'm calling the one who's baying, the reason why I'm looking at it over the other sheep is because it's bigger, right? It's lower in the visual field. Even though it looks level, the feet of the big one are clearly lower in the visual field than the one in the back. So clearly the bigger one is closer to us. So even though those two have very similar qualities, symmetrical, meaningful, surrounded by other elements in the scene, convex, they have a lot of things in common. The bigger sheep has the benefit of those other two things, being bigger and being lower. And so that's why I think that one's catching our attention. At least it's the one I favored. The global processing tends to take precedence. What that means is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when we're interpreting things that we're looking out on the world, we tend to say things like, that looks like a picture from the British Isles. We don't say things like, that's a picture of two sheep, one wearing a collar and a bell in the middle of saying bah, and the other one looking like it hasn't been sheared lately, and in front of a field of heather. We don't say stuff like that. We say the sum. This looks like a picture from the British Isles. So the global tends to take precedence. Our understanding of the scene tends to be based on the cohesive nature of the scene. Now, let's apply these concepts to this image. Okay. So for me, when I first saw this image, the first thing that popped out to me is the black word that says ground. And then inside of that, you see there's the letters spelling out figure. So you've got figure inside of ground. Figure is, the same color as the greenish yellow. I don't know what color that is. So why am I seeing ground first? I see it's bigger. It's more symmetrical, right? Look how they had to make the G look to make that into the G for figure, right? Whereas the letters that are spelling out ground are a lot more consistent with what you would expect the letters to look like, right? So they aren't as symmetrical as a regular letter. The black letters that spell out ground are more meaningful because they're popping out right away, clearly saying ground, whereas you have to kind of work for it to see figure. Now, here's a little debate moment. Surrounded by other elements in the scene. So the word ground is surrounded by all the splotches and decorative things that they put on there. So yeah, it's surrounded by other elements in the scene. But we could make a really strong argument that the word figure is the most surrounded by other elements of the scene. I think the reason why it's not the first thing that pops out for me is because everything else is favoring ground. Every other thing on this list is favoring the word ground. Now, lower in the visual field, they are the same height, right? Because figure's inside of ground, but I think we could argue that the bottom of the letters of ground are beneath the level of the letters that make up figure. So I think ground has that on its side. And then convex, the way that they drew the black letters seem to be coming at us more than the way that the empty space that forms the word figure, that doesn't seem to have that convex quality. So it seems like everything is really leaning towards ground being the first thing noticed, except for possibly the word, the fact meaningful and surrounded by the other elements in the scene. But I think those are debatable, right? So I think that's why, for me, the first thing I see is ground. All right, global precedence, the Ebbinghaus illusion. Poor Ebbinghaus, let's take a moment. We're going to talk about him several times in this class. Let's just take a moment to talk about how many things have Ebbinghaus as the name, but how poor Ebbinghaus never could secure a job as a psychologist. Like he could never get a teaching position or a researching position. He was, it was shortly after Wundt had founded his lab. It was a baby little science. It really makes the argument that maybe Ebbinghaus was difficult to work with or something. He did a lot of his research on himself as his only N of 1 data. Lots of people have replicated it and shown that his performance was very much what you would expect people to do. But he came up with great ideas and had a lot of difficulty sort of establishing his career. So it's kind of a sad tale. Anyway, all right, this is the Ebbinghaus illusion. All right, so what we see is a dark circle, and on the left, it's surrounded by big light blue circles, and on the right, it's surrounded by little light blue circles. And what the illusion is that on the left, the dark blue circle looks smaller than the dark blue circle looks on the right. In fact, these circles are in fact the exact same size, but our brain says, no, they're not. Our brain says that the dark blue is clearly smaller on the left than the dark blue on the right is. And so Ebbinghaus pointed out that context matters in your judgments of size, right? Being surrounded by big circles makes this one on the left look smaller. Being surrounded by small circles makes the one on the right look bigger. And so that's part of that global precedence. Right now, if you wanted to test my claim, and I showed you with my little circle that I created and I did the movement on, so I promise you it is the same circle that I just used a motion path to make it move over. You can test it yourself by eliminating the context and sort of like looking through your hand so that only the dark blue shows up, and then move over and only the dark blue shows up. And you'll see that they are in fact the same. You can measure them. They are in fact the same. But it's such a powerful illusion, isn't it, that the one on the left looks so much smaller than the one on the right. Global precedence. We take all of that into consideration, all the context, all of those things, and that helps us to make our judgments. All right, let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back in the next video and we'll talk about how our perceptual system maintains constancy.